Welcome everyone to today's August 5th, 2021 Helm Developer Call meeting. Glad to have people on board. We're going to follow the normal process, which is announcements and discussions. So we'll start with announcements. As usual, next batch release, second Wednesday of the month. So that'll be August 11th. That'll be 364. I don't know if there's any, I had checked actually if there was nothing pending 2 days ago. I don't know if something has happened since, but there's about a week left to get those last things in. 370 RC, that'll be September 8th. So we're about a month away. I don't know if anybody has any comments on that. So don't delay a month before the RC is cut. If there's no more announcements, we can move on to discussion. Bridget, first item is from you. I'll give you the floor.
Sure, absolutely. A community member reached out and asked if we had an open issue or HIP, something that relates to the OSI model for signatures, because there's something on the provenance page that kind of says like, jump in and participate in this. If you take a look at that page, just right at the bottom, there's something that sort of implies there might be some work in progress. I couldn't find the work in progress. So I'm wondering if anyone knows what that note means. If anyone recalls, in the specific wording, this is an open line of inquiry in the Helm team. If you're interested, jump in, you know, chain of trust, etc. Does anyone remember what that was or what's going on with it? I'm looking at you, Farina, because you unmuted.
I don't. In fact, I wonder how old this is from the docs. No, in fact, we're probably not even going to go down any OSI model route around signatures. I'm not sure which route we're going to end up going with signatures. I mean, right now it's PGP signatures, and most people use GPG in order to do that. If anything, it might be, we may end up down the SIG store route, if folks are familiar with that. But that's still yet to be determined, and I'm kind of curious what'll come of it. SIG store is the new effort under the Linux Foundation around signing and verifying things in as far as software supply chain goes. It's sigstore.dev. I don't even think they've actually had a release yet, a stable release yet, but they're working on it.
Okay, so it sounds like maybe we should modify that page in the docs since it's misleading, and then.
Yeah, there's no work going on in this space.
All right, that answers my question. And then this next bit, Helm 4, Farina,
that was me who put it on. Yeah, Butcher and I put it on together. I expected him to be here today. But if we all remember, and by the way, folks, if you have anything else you want to add to the agenda, please do so now because we can get to it after this. But there was the HIP 12. I'm going to pull it up here. HIP 12 is all about Helm version 4. And if you go to HIP 12, you will see that the timeline will be approximately, down there it says, naming of release engineer, September 2021. That's next month. And so approximately around that time, we would name a release engineer. In fact, the kickoff meeting is tentatively set for October of 2021, you know, after we have a release engineer named. And so this is one of those things, you know, we wanted to bring onto everybody's radar, because as just part of doing Helm version 4 and going down that road, we have a process, and we'll need a release engineer to wrangle that process and the folks around it. So I'll ask this because there are a number of maintainers on. Is anybody interested in being the release engineer? And the qualifications do require you to be a Helm maintainer to be the release engineer on it. So if somebody's not, they would need to go to become a Helm maintainer first. and be familiar with the code. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, and
We
Scott's
can, but-
answering in the chat for some reason.
Yeah, I just didn't want to interrupt in case other people had thoughts, but I had mentioned this a while ago, and I did one of them a while back, but I'd be willing to do that again.
The release engineer is specifically the person who oversees the entire process of Helm 4, not just cutting the release. Oversees the whole process for development, API changes, HIPs, all of it. So it's not, maybe that's a good way to put it, is it's the person, the single point who oversees Helm version 4 from a technical coordination standpoint.
Right, so the Helm 4 release lead or whatever.
And so it's dealing with approving HIPs.
For that right now. I know I'm not going to have the bandwidth to do quite that, but I will say that I would be happy to tag team helping on the SDK side of that, which is what was my next note was going to be. But I'll save that one.
Okay. Since do we have anything else yet added? We do. Mark's showing. So I was going to say the other thing about Helm 4 is I was curious, just to open up thoughts here, of what folks would want to see changed in Helm 4 and why. I didn't know if anybody had any ideas off the top of their head to start brainstorming or getting ideas out there, but that is one of those things.
Yeah, one question on that, Matt. What comes first? The release engineer, or is there going to be a Helm 4? Or do they both kind of come together? Or does the release engineer come first and then we set up meetings and think about, is 4 a runner? Is there enough stories in there that make sense to have a Helm 4? Or is it just a series of, features kind of?
I'll read you what the HIP says. It says, during the course of development, it may turn out that there is not sufficient reason to continue development of Helm 4. For example, there may not be enough feature HIPs to justify releasing, or the HIPs may not achieve enough sponsorship to support from the Helm project maintainers. In this case, the Helm maintainers may hold a circuit breaker vote that halt Helm 4 development until such time when it is warranted. The process of halting Helm 4 development will be a simple majority vote by the Helm project maintainers. And it's during the course of development. So we'd probably have to kick off the process. We'd have a release engineer kick it off, start hearing the HIPs and ideas come in, and we see, okay, there isn't enough to do. We're going to halt development. That's what I would expect something like that to be. But we have to kick off the process and honestly start taking ideas and things in to know whether there's enough.
Okay, yeah. So we're going to have some sort of kickoff meeting at some stage.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And we have a Helm release for release engineer before we do the kickoff, so that person can be involved in organizing and doing their role in it. So that's what's outlined in the process right now.
Matt, to your initial question on what would you like to see in Helm 4, is that something that you wanted to have thoughts discussed now, or would you want it to be put in some issue or HIP directly?
So as far as the way we're going to do the thoughts for Helm version 4, since it's what we can do in Helm 4 is make breaking changes. That's the kind of thing that we'd want in HIP form. But if somebody had a teaser of an idea for a HIP they'd want to write, I'd be curious to hear it now.
Okay, yeah, I think this is not much of a teaser in general, but then we've been seeing a bunch of Helm-related CRDs proliferate in different popular communities. Like Flux has Helm-related things in a bunch of different places. I'd be curious if we have the appetite to consider Helm-specific representations of Helm releases on the cluster, for example. Like today, there is no way to do something like like a kubectl get Helm releases or kubectl get Helm charts to understand these are the charts that are available that the cluster admin made available for users of the cluster to use and install. Is there an appetite for something like that? Do you think that makes sense, or
Yeah. So
do you think
part
we
of this,
considered this in the past and said no?
so part of this is to look at where Helm sits in the scheme of things, right? So Helm's a package manager, and I think of it like apt, yum, homebrew, things like that. But you can build tools on top of it that do all kinds of stuff. Like there's Ansible, Chef. We've had so many different tools that manage packages and do things like that that sit at a higher level. And in the Helm space, we've seen both the push and the pull model, right? There's operators like the Flux Helm operator that do a pull model and pull and install things into a cluster. And it's kind of that Chef model. Other tools like Helm file have been a push model to push things into clusters. And so the way we go about doing this in there is it's about trying to be that great package manager and not enforce a particular style, because people are doing things in different styles and building tools on top. It's that separation of concerns. And so we'd have to figure out how it works within that kind of space to make that generally happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think
And so
that's.
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I'd have to see the specific proposal and how it worked, and yet still enabled different groups to have that leeway and sit within that package management space.
I see. Yeah, I think that totally makes sense. I think the discussion should eventually lead to Helm does this great thing well as a package manager. Does it need to do anything more than that? If yes, there's got to be a strong reason why, because it does, go in, like it does get us into waters which we didn't get into initially as part of Helm 3, and that should be a well thought out thing. So yeah, I think what you said makes sense.
Some other.
Go ahead.
No, and you said. All right, so are we done with this one? Because I could throw something out there.
Yes, please.
All right, so the idea of Helm might have multiple resources within their templates, right? Multiple resources for Kubernetes, templatize. The values file provides a way to an interface to come in and provide some values for those templates. But then the idea of some of those resources might not even be something the user that's deploying the Helm chart has access to. Like, for example, the operator of the cluster came in and said, you know what, this person of this role does not have access to create secrets or create secrets, for example, right? At that point, the chart becomes inconsistent and depends tightly on the security model of the cluster. Is that something that we thought about before at all? And how can we help that experience where a user knows ahead of time, even before it tries to read the errors, that this chart is not going to work for you given your security profile? You know what I mean?
So yeah, I mean, Helm works just like other tools that work against it. You act as a user with whatever permissions you have to do things.
Mm-hmm.
The one thing where may become a little bit complicated is specifically around secrets, because Helm by default stores its release information in secrets. And so if somebody decided to cut off secret access to somebody, well, that's going to be very limiting. For example, if they go to deploy an application and it's got credentials, how can they store those credentials securely? It does create a very limiting situation for a user of that cluster. They can't take most things off the internet that say, here's how you would do this, because they don't have access to the primary way of storing secret information. Helm, though, because we realize you may not want to or may not have access to, you can store things in different ways. Secrets are the default, but the legacy form we used to before secrets existed, because Helm's been along the longest, config maps. Mm-hmm. We also do have support for Postgres database as a store as well, if you have access to that. And this is pluggable, and we are open to additions even in the Helm 3 timeframe of other backend stores to store the release information other than secrets. And so even that one point where you can get hooked into, we do have alternative paths if somebody needs to go down that route. But as far as permissions goes, because that's the permissions model, it's the security
Right.
part of the security model here. You can only create the things of which you have access, and the things you don't, you can't. And so if you want to install a chart or even use kubectl to put something in, you just simply can't, because you
Won't be able to do it, right? But
Yeah.
is there any way to maybe simplify the way the user realizes this early, as opposed to, you know, eventually the person is going to realize, because it's going to come back and read the errors coming back from Kubernetes, right? And it's going to realize, hey, this is not, you don't have permissions, right? But,
Yeah, and there may be a way to tell somebody earlier they don't have permission.
like in the
but-
catalog, or, you know, something like that. I don't know. Is I've seen it as a problem in some clusters where people say, this chart sucks, but really your security module, the security model, your permissions is the ones that is in the way, not really the chart, you know?
I could see the potential for a Helm plugin that would look at the rendered templates and run a bunch of like kubectl, is it CANI, against them to see if they can perform those actions against the cluster, and then provide a yes,
early
I can,
feedback.
just keep going,
Yeah.
or no, I can't, fail out.
I was thinking also, for example, like a partial release. Like you could say, look, there's some resources you can deploy, but someone else with the right permissions will have to come in and deploy all the resources for the same chart, right? And it'll be, you know, like a release A, release B type of thing. Of course, that complicates things too. I mean, there's always
So that
price
creates
to
that's, I mean,
for-
this is kind of getting into the advanced user cases, right? We've got different people managing different parts, and that's more about
Right.
release management than package management, right? I touched on it a little before. Helm's a package manager. It's not a tool like Ansible, or we bring in these different parts to how do we make the one package, all these different people deploy different parts of it.
right.
That's really getting into individual release policies and release management and that kind of thing. And I think that's probably beyond the scope of a package manager. I mean, you're not going to see apt doing something like that. You're not going to see Yum doing something like that, because they deal with that package management part. And if something needs to be divided up and handled differently, then the people who do that and have to deal with that complex orchestration are the ones who divide things up.
Yeah,
Right,
Helm
it-
happens to be a little bit more complex than apt, because they can put together so many things, right? I've seen Helm charts that are, you know, GitLab Helm chart is a whole lab in a chart.
I've seen things with apt that might blow your mind back
I
in the
know,
day of the
I was about to
complexities
say
that
that.
could be installed, just because people are doing it for some of those. And something like, if you're going to install GitLab, right, you'll need the permissions in the cluster in order to do that.
A lot of
right?
permissions. Yeah.
You do need those permissions to do it. And somebody else doing something else in the cluster may not need that same level of permissions, but to have a package
Right.
that can install something like that, you could have an apt package that could install something akin to GitLab and it would
Right.
work. But you'd also need permissions on that system in order to install that particular
That
package. And
big one,
the same
yeah.
idea applies. And so, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, that's a good feedback.
Okay, there's two more items on the list, although mine was just because there wasn't much on the list at the beginning. So we can get back to the Helm 4 if we have extra time. Scott, you have an item on the list about the SDK?
Yeah, I do, but you know, I want to not take up additional time for this because I just remembered that there's a PR that might actually address this. But I'll give a little bit of context of why I mentioned it. It really is to accompany what I said just a few moments ago when Matt was asking about releasing a release lead, which I don't want to do. But in terms of you know, tag teaming on a certain component of that, or helping in some way with that piece of it. This is just one example where I'm aware that other projects that are heavily using Helm's SDK heavily, for example, Flux's Helm operator and Helm controller, have run into a lot of edge cases. People are trying as best as possible to get issues fixed upstream in Helm. For example, I think it's the only, as far as I know, like CD project that doesn't fork Helm or do its own weird stuff in order to get around some of the SDK problems. Anyway, point is I'd like to spend a bit more time on that, and there's some interesting places where the SDK does things that make a lot of sense for the CLI, but don't make a lot of sense for other uses that have their own kind of retry logic or other things that are outside of the scope of the CLI, the client. Yeah.
So when Matt Butcher, who's joined us now, and I were talking about this stuff yesterday, actually rewriting or updating the SDK would be one of my biggest things for Helm version 4, because we're using it in Hipper and other places, and we learned, hey, it would be so nice if we could do some of this stuff differently. It would make our lives a lot easier. And so that's the thing that I want to focus on in Helm version 4 is actually making, well, the CLI experience a little bit better. I've got ideas around that, but really making that SDK a much better SDK. And I think the Helm 3 SDK is great because before that, we really didn't have this. And then we built it around what we knew. And now in Helm 3, we've learned so much by people using it that now we can adjust it to make it more accommodating to those other circumstances because we've learned.
Exactly. And my concern is that there may not be enough visibility into the problems people have run into. For example, I don't know how many of the Hipper issues that you, or the issues that you ran into while working on Hipper have made its way into issues and pull requests yet. I mean, maybe they all have been, but I know that for others, there's such a high amount of work involved with that, and we know that there's such there's a finite amount of attention that Helm maintainers have to work on the SDK at this point, at least for Helm 3, that I think the issues people are very judicious in what they raise. So I was wondering if maybe Matt, one of the things we could do is have a brainstorm a bit about our experiences with using the SDK. I would be happy, like just a sidebar, I'd be happy to be a stenographer, take notes, as well as offer my experiences so far. Maybe we can get some other people that we know are using the SDK and just see if we can flesh out those stories.
Yeah, I think that would be a really helpful thing. I've personally held off on that until Helm 4 starts because I've only got so much brain space and I didn't want that to invade it until Helm 4 starts.
Exactly.
But yes, I think that's a wonderful idea.
Okay, I'll make action item. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Scott, for bringing that up. Like I said, I added an item. Basically, there's a PR that I posted 5 months ago. It was implementing HIP 8 or a part of HIP 8. It's minor. It adds descriptions to completions. So if somebody has the time, I just thought I'd mention it. I was hoping to get it into 3.7. So since there's only 4 weeks left, I wanted to bring it up. It should be relatively easy. You've got a lot of good stuff into 3.7 so far with completions, PowerShell completions, all kinds of neat stuff there. So yeah, let's get this in. Thank you, Wes. There's a 5 minutes left. Anybody have something else, or do you want to get back to Helm 4 discussion? Maybe Dr. Butcher has something to add because he joined in a little bit late. No. The floor is open. Oh, volunteers. Thank you, Bridget. Do we need, we do need volunteers for, I think, everything. Triage. Maybe that's the first one.
I'll take triage again.
Thank you, Mr. Farina. We need notes and moderator.
I want to volunteer for moderator again because I was 2 minutes late for this meeting, and so you had to take over for me. Thank you, by the way.
So Scott for moderator. Anybody for notes?
I can take notes.
Thank you, Bridget. So that leaves us with 4 minutes. Anything else to discuss? So do you want any other suggestions for Helm 4, or do we leave you to the summer?
Question for the additional ideas people have about Helm 4. Do we want individual HIPs? Do we want everything appended to some specific Helm 4 document? Do we want people to label the issues with the Helm 4 label? Like, what's our best move right now for putting Helm 4 ideas in? I see Scott has ideas.
So the process formally calls for us to go through HIPs to do the changes and actually use the HIP process for all of this stuff. And so we'll need that. What I would suggest though is I bet you some of us have the similar or same ideas of things that we think should go in. And it might be useful for us to come up with our ideas and start circulating them. So that way we can see who's got those same ideas. And then maybe we can work together on creating the HIPs or figure out who wants to do it among it. That might be a good way to kind of soft orchestrate it. But the formal process for this from the HIP is to file more HIPs.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was saying earlier, Matt, was, this is kind of, if we don't have the backlog, I think that's part of the HIP as well. What it says in the HIP is that we need this backlog of the potential work items to work on to see the feasibility then. So, yeah.
The reason I ask is because there are a bunch of items that have a V4 label. So I was wondering, should people who care about each of those items make each one into a specific HIP? Like, is that our move? Or do we want one HIP? Go ahead, Scott.
So my suggestion, it really is just reiterating that action item from earlier, and it relates to what Matt was saying. In order to be as efficient as possible, and also to reduce or to make the signal to noise ratio more tolerable for maintainers as well, perhaps we can really just open up that, announce to the mailing list, open up that brainstorm to anyone who wants to join. And if folks can't join it synchronously, during those times, then we could just have some other form for discussion, whether we want to stick with Slack or whether we want to make it more persistent, like enable GitHub discussions on one of the repos or something that focuses on Helm 4 or something like that. I know we had discussed that a while back, but it might make more sense when we're talking about 4 so that we can have some asynchronous chat. There's different ways to do it, but those are just some ideas. I think the main point is that if we try to collate similar ideas, then we won't just have the kind of cumbersome, HIP process is great, but it's not great for rapid collaboration. It's good for taking rapid collaboration, then putting it into a proposal, If that was clear, I guess what I'm saying is yes to HIP, of course, but we can help to filter out some of the otherwise overlapping and repetitive stuff by collaborating and communicating in advance.
I agree that a brainstorming session is going to be really valuable.
Maybe some metadata, like a good summary is always good, right? So a good summary saying this is what this is about, synthesize the idea, then people can just go through that before adding a new idea. You know what I mean? So a good summary is always great when it comes to finding duplicates like this.
When you say summary, you mean in an issue or in
maybe
in a meeting or
something that's easily searchable and visible. You know what I mean? So it doesn't have to be the HIP itself. It could be a link. It could be something that links to the HIP, right? That then we can just an index of ideas with a good title and a good section with description, a few paragraphs, and then that gives people with that had to search quickly and they don't have the bandwidth, right, to come in and say, oh that idea is not there.
Scott mentioned, me too, I was thinking maybe our notes, an open Google document that people could throw ideas in, and that could be the first step. And then essentially, if the idea is judged interesting, then because HIP does have a bit of an overhead and it's a bit of an effort. So maybe a vetting at the beginning is a good idea.
A good idea, I think too. Yeah.
All right, we'll have to stop. We are 1 minute past the time. Thank you everybody for joining in during the summer. Have a good rest of the day and hopefully a good month of August. Everybody take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye all. Thank you. Bye.